One of the most important concepts of philosophy is that of an essence. We tend to think that objects have essences and that we can distinguish essential from accidental properties. The essential properties are those that really are necessary to being an object of a certain kind or to being that particular object, to being me, for example. But what exactly do we mean by an essence? John Locke thinks that the tradition going all the way back to Aristotle and extending throughout medieval philosophy, actually is making a mistake about the nature of essence. Or at least let's say that it's identifying a number of different concepts that really ought to be distinguished. He sees distinguishing them as vital to understanding what the nature of an object is, what the nature of a kind of object is, and in general describing the world. I think it's an important point that he's doing this after the scientific revolution. John Locke was himself a man of science. He was a medical doctor. That's his training. That was his profession. And so that gives him a different perspective on things. He looks at the essence of something and says, well, there are certain things by which we recognize it, but then there's also an underlying nature. And those are two different things. Often, it's a difficult scientific problem, exactly which correlate with which. What the underlying nature is that actually leads something to be exhibited and to appear to us in a certain way. So he distinguishes real from nominal essences. Let's go back to Aristotle, the classic text for understanding what essence is all about. We've seen that Aristotle gives us a number of different characterizations of essence. So essence, he says, is what it is to be a thing, what a thing is by virtue of itself, what it is by its very nature, what's expressed by a definition of it. Now, it might be a thing, an individual object, or it might be a kind of thing. We might be interested in what it is to be a human being or what it is to be me. But in any case, the essence of X is understood by Aristotle to be what it is to be X, what it is to be that thing or a thing of that kind. What X is by virtue of itself, what it is by its very nature, what's expressed by a definition of it. Well, those don't seem, at least obviously, to be the same thing. Aristotle treats them all as characterizations of ways of understanding essence, and he acts as if that's one thing. This nature is what it is to be the thing. It's what that thing is by virtue of itself. It's what we would express in a definition. But is he right about that? Are those really all the same idea? And do they end up referring to the same thing? Do they distinguish my essential properties from my accidental properties in the same way? Thomas Aquinas was a commentator on Aristotle and a great philosopher of the medieval period who developed his own take on Aristotelian thought. He looked at this and said, I think there are actually several different concepts here. Let's call the essence of something the properties that are necessary to that thing, without which it wouldn't be what it is. So the essence, most directly, of me are the properties necessary to being me, without which I would not be who I am. The properties that are essential to a human being, so the essence of humanity, you might say, are the properties necessary to being a human being, without which you wouldn't be a human being. But he says the other characterizations of Aristotle seem to be describing two different things. There is this question of what would correspond to the definition of the thing in the world. That he calls the quiddity, quidditas in Latin, which just translates literally as whatness. It's no more natural in Latin than it is in English to say the whatness of the thing. But it's a way of saying, look, it's what it is. So if we give a definition, we say, who is that? What is that person? Well, that's a human being. Or maybe we're referring to somebody's social role. We say, well, what does that person do? Oh, that person's an accountant. And what we're doing there is giving something that corresponds to a certain kind of definition. And that's a legitimate way of responding. We might say, that is a tiger. What's a tiger? It's a striped feline of a certain kind. And in general, we could describe things in that way. We can give a definition to describe the essence of the kind. Maybe we can even do that with an individual thing. The nature of a thing, Aquinas says, that's a different concept. That's what makes it what it is. That's what it really is to be that thing. It's what that thing is by virtue of itself. Now, in some sense, it is also necessary to the thing. But the crucial point here is that it is the nature of it in the sense that it gives it its other properties. So there's one question we can raise. What's necessary to being this thing or a thing of this kind? The other is, what makes things of that kind, things of that kind? What makes me me? And you might think those are the same as Aristotle does, but you might also think they're at least different concepts as Aquinas does. And you might think maybe they're really different. Different answers get proposed for those questions. Now, Aquinas does draw that distinction between the essence in the more general way and then the quiddity and the nature. But it doesn't, except when applied to God, play a huge role in his philosophy. Locke thinks it's actually a vital distinction and thinks that we need to pay close attention to what Aquinas has done there. Because for Locke, that really ends up being a fundamental distinction. After the scientific revolution, that's no minor point. The nature of X is usually going to be given by science. On the other hand, the quiddity of X, what corresponds to its definition, that's often a question of language. And so one of those is going to be characterized by us. It's going to be mind-dependent. It's going to be socially determined in many ways, how we use the term. That will determine the quiddity. But the nature of the thing, that's a deep and often, he thinks, insoluble scientific question. So, here's how Locke would put these distinctions. He says, Aristotle and Aquinas tend to think these all end up in the same place, at least generally. The essence, the properties necessary to the thing, the quiddity, what corresponds to its definition, and then the nature, what makes it what it is. They think all those are the same, but they're not the same. He calls one of those the real essence of the thing, and the other the nominal essence of the thing. So let's take an example to see where he's really going with this. Here is Aquinas, as he would draw the distinction with respect to something specific, like wax. The essence of wax, well, that's the properties necessary to wax, without which wax wouldn't be wax. The quiddity is what corresponds to wax's definition in the world. So look up a definition of wax, and you might see something that corresponds to its quiddity. It's usually commonsensical and done in terms of what Locke refers to as secondary properties, secondary qualities. But the nature of wax, that's what makes wax what it is. So if we fill those in, Locke says, we're going to get different answers. The essence, well, that's some combination. The properties necessary to being wax are some combination of the following. The quiddity, that's the compound that is malleable near ambient temperatures. If you look up in a dictionary, that tends to be what it says for wax. It's a compound that's malleable near ambient, in other words, ordinary room temperatures. But the nature of wax, that's the underlying scientific analysis of wax. And that's quite different. Then we'd say it's an organic compound that consists of long alkyl chains. Well, you don't look at it and say, oh yeah, look at all those alkyl chains. Wax doesn't look like that. That's a scientific characterization. So Locke says it matters a lot whether I'm saying what corresponds to the definition of wax. That's to be a compound malleable at ambient temperatures, so that you can easily form it into candles, and you can form it and use it, you stamp it, for example, and so forth. That's one thing. But the other is to say, what makes it what it is? What makes it wax? That's its chemical composition. That has to do with those long alkyl chains. So those are rather different characterizations. Locke says, take seriously what Aquinas says here, what he's doing, and you realize these don't end up in the same place, even for ordinary material objects, let alone God. They end up in very different places. One of them is given by our ordinary use of a word. The other is given by the underlying scientific analysis of the thing. So, here is how Locke describes this. What Aquinas calls the quiddity, Locke says, I'm going to call that the nominal essence of the thing. Nominal because it's connected to the meaning of the name for that thing or that kind of thing. It's a question of the definition of the term we use for this, and so it's something that is linguistic. It's a verbal question to a large extent, a conceptual question, if we want to put it at the level of thought rather than the level of language. It's a compound, in this case, malleable near ambient temperatures. That's something like the nominal essence of wax. It gives us the definition. It characterizes the way we use the term in ordinary contexts. But the nature of wax, what makes wax what it is, that's a scientific question of the real essence of wax. what he calls the real internal constitution of wax. And that's something that's given by science, in this case, the organic compound consisting of long alkyl chains. Those are rather different sorts of answers. The nominal essence and the real essence aren't the same. The nominal essence just being one that interacts with us, you might say, in certain ways. But the nature, that is something that it has in itself, and that's something that is pertaining to its real underlying constitution. So Locke, in general, distinguishes two kinds of essence here. A nominal essence, which is what Aristotle would have simply called essence, the thing that corresponds to a definition, that Aquinas would have called quiddity. It uses secondary qualities. It's something that is shaped by our use of the term, and so it's mind-dependent typically. The real essence is the nature of the thing in Aquinas' terms. It's what makes it what it is, and it's a question of its real internal constitution. This is Locke's analysis, then, of essences and the way we use the names of substances, things like wax or water or gold. He says they really have a double reference in their ordinary use. First, sometimes they're made to stand for, and so their signification is supposed to agree to the real constitution of things. This is the real essence, from which all their properties flow. That's the nature, making it what it is, and in which they all center. But this real constitution, or as it's apt to be called, essence, being utterly unknown to us, remember, he's writing at the dawn of the scientific revolution. He's writing at a time when we do not have chemical theory, when the underlying real internal constitution of something like wax, let alone water or gold or any other chemical element, is unknown. And so from his point of view, he's got the atomic theory. He is himself a medical doctor. He understands that there are these real underlying natures that it's the job of science to investigate. But science at his time doesn't tell him what they are. So he says, look, to us, they're unknown, but there is some real internal constitution. Any sound that's put to stand for it must be uncertain in its application. Uncertain because, he says, really we're tying this term to something, some kind of real internal constitution, but often we don't know what that is. Secondly, the simple ideas that are found to coexist in substances being that which their names immediately signify. That's the nominal essence. That's what corresponds to the definition. So he says, it's not just a question of two kinds of definition, real definition and scientific definition, for example. Well, really, I should say scientific definition and everyday definition, or of two kinds of essence, real and nominal essence. It's partly a question of how we even treat a term like wax, or water, or gold, or some other term that today we refer to as natural kind terms. Those terms have a kind of double signification, he's saying. We generally have an everyday type definition of those, and that's one way in which we use the term. It's kind of related to the everyday concept that we have. It's part of the meaning of the word. It's what you find in a dictionary if you look it up. But the other is the true nature of the thing as science may or may not have revealed it to us. And so when we use a term like gold, or tiger, or water, or wax, there's a kind of dual thing going on here. We're partly talking about that thing that's, for example, malleable at ambient temperatures, but partly we're referring to, well, that kind of thing. Whatever that kind of thing is, now we can say consisting of long alkyl chains, but Locke couldn't have said that. He had no theory of this. But still, he would realize there is some real internal constitution. And that creates a problem, because often the definition in the dictionary is pretty clear. I know how to do that. The real internal constitution may or may not be anything that I can identify, or that even a scientist can identify. There may simply yet be no scientific account of what that essence is. Well, let's take a look at his definition of a nominal essence. To be a man, or of the species man, and have the essence of a man is the same thing. Now, since nothing can be a man or have a right to the name man, but what has a conformity to the abstract idea the name stands for, nor anything be a man or have a right to the species man, but what has the essence of that species, it follows that the abstract idea for which the name stands and the essence of the species are one and the same. From whence it's easy to observe that the essences of the sorts of things, and consequently the sorting of things, is the workmanship of the understanding that abstracts and makes those general ideas. So nominal essences, in short, are really behind most of our uses of our terms. We use terms like man or water or gold or wax on the basis of the meaning of this term, which relates to the concept, what he called the abstract idea of these things. And we generally identify them by their perceptual properties. Crafting these kinds in that way, we group together things that are similar with respect to those properties. And so we end up defining kinds, defining essences in this nominal way, defining meanings of terms and the content of our concepts. But all of that is something we're doing. And so nominal essences are things that are the workmanship of the understanding. They are mind-dependent. They are things we craft to help us understand the world. We group together things as tables and chairs, or as water or gold or wax. And when we do that, we're doing it for our own reasons, our own convenience, because of similarities, because of our own purposes. That may or may not match the underlying scientific natures of these things. So the real essence, he says, that's a matter of the real internal constitution of the thing. It is real. It is mind independent. It's what science investigates as the true nature of the thing that makes it what it is. It makes it have the properties we identify the abstract idea, the concept, the term with. And so, yes, we identify wax as something malleable at ambient temperatures, but what's its underlying nature? That's something revealed by the real essence. That's a question of the real internal constitution of wax. It's often unknown, he says. At his time, almost always unknown. At our time, well, still sometimes unknown. But it is the true underlying nature of the thing or kind of thing. And so that is a different sort of essence. Well, you might think, okay, good. I can realize now, I can characterize an essence in two ways. I can do it in a way that is mind-dependent and that corresponds to the everyday definition of the term, gives you roughly the content of my everyday concept. But I can also characterize it in terms that are scientific. And even if I don't know what the science exactly is, I can say, well, whatever is the real internal constitution of that kind of thing. And in that way, not pretend to be able to say, it's an organic compound consisting of long alkyl chains or anything like that. I, for example, use the term tiger, but I can't really give you a biological definition of a tiger. What exactly is a tiger? I don't know. It's whatever scientists are going to figure out is the nature of a tiger. That is the real internal constitution of a tiger. That's the real essence of tiger. So sometimes we may not know what it is, but we hypothesize there is one if tigers at least really are a natural kind and form a family, as scientists will eventually find out. Yes, there is a unity to this family, and that leads us to call all of those animals tigers. Let's consider a few examples. Here is one, gold. Those coins are gold. And we can say, okay, what is the real essence of gold? What is the nominal essence? Notice they're different. If we think about gold, we think, well, here is what happens if we think about our intuitive concept. Maybe we don't know much about the nature of gold scientifically, and we just say, well, it's a heavy yellow metal. Maybe we have a more refined one, valuable heavy yellow metal. Maybe we know it's not really always yellow. There can be white gold and so on. So maybe we say, well, it's a heavy metal that is often yellow, but the color is really coming from some impurities. Whatever it is, we're going to give that kind of characterization in terms of secondary qualities. But what is the real essence of gold? Well, it's the element with atomic number 79. That's its real essence. Locke couldn't have known that, but it's something we can know. We can say, that's the real essence of gold, and it's by virtue of being that element that it is heavy, that it is yellow, that it is a metal, and so forth, has the other characteristics that it has. What about water? Well, that too has a real and a nominal essence. We can talk about essence in the general sense as what's necessary to being water. But then we can say, well, nominal essence, that's the thing that is crafted by the understanding, displays the workmanship of the understanding, and so is defined by the meaning of our term, the content of our concept. The nominal essence is something like this. It's a colorless, tasteless liquid, at common temperatures anyway, necessary to life. Maybe again it gets more refined. We can say below a certain temperature it turns into ice, above a certain temperature to steam. We can say a variety of things about it that are all at that kind of intuitive level and described in terms of secondary qualities. Well, that's characterizing the nominal essence of water. But what is the underlying nature of water? What makes water water? That's a different question. The real essence of water is being H2O. And so in this case, we can say, with Aquinas and Locke, but against Aristotle, look, what you're describing here are two different things. What corresponds to the definition of the term, and what is the true nature of the thing making it what it is. Those are different things. What makes it what it is that it's H2O. But the way we use the term in our ordinary concept, they're tied to the perceptual properties of water. Well, before I get to another and somewhat trickier example, let's take something that isn't a natural kind term and see how this works. In another video, I was talking about ships. I was talking about the ship of Theseus, and in particular, well, we gave it a name. We call it the Argo. And the idea was its planks get replaced, somebody gathers up the planks, rebuilds the ship according to the original plan, which is the Argo. Well, leave that question aside, though it's related to our question, because we could say, well, what is essential to being a ship? And what is essential to being the Argo? Let's take ship first. That's not really a natural kind. So define ship for me. That would be the nominal essence. It might be a vessel created for sailing in water. Maybe that's a pretty bad definition. I'm not sure. I haven't thought a lot about it. But whatever is the concept that we associate with ship, whatever is the meaning of our term, ship, we'd say that's the nominal essence. Now, if I ask, what's the real internal constitution? What's the real essence? What is it that makes it a ship? Notice it's not really anything different. We'd say, well, it's not like ships all have the same internal constitution. The way that gold all has the same internal constitution of consisting of, atomic number 79 atoms. It's not a question of water all being H2O or anything like that. Instead, it's just being a vessel constructed for sailing. It's not something that goes anywhere beyond that. So in short, in that kind of concepts or terms that are not natural kind terms, but are instead socially defined in terms of their function or something like that, there is no underlying real essence to investigate, or you could just say they're just the same thing. The real essence is, what makes it what it is that it's a vessel capable of sailing. So that's all you have to say. There's nothing more. So in short, real and nominal essences, if we want to talk about real essences at all in this context, they're just the same. There's no distinction to be drawn. So Aristotle's right about things like that. What about particular objects like the Argo? What's essential to being the Argo? Now here, it's harder to answer. Maybe it's having a particular matter in particular form, in which case we might want to say the rebuilt ship really has the true essence of the Argo. Maybe we want to say it is a question of being continuous with this original ship, and so we track it this way. It's not entirely clear what we want to say about an individual ship and what makes it the same ship. But my point is, once again, there is actually no difference between the real and nominal essence. Whatever we give there, it's going to be our way of saying what it is to be the Argo. And there's no difference between the real internal constitution and that more socially defined thing. What corresponds to the definition and the true essence of the thing, what makes it what it is, are just the same, whether we have in mind the individual ship or the kind ship. When we think about natural kind terms, however, it's different. These come apart. The natural kind term tends to have a nominal essence described in terms of secondary qualities. The real essence in terms of primary qualities, and they're different. So let's look at an example from Hilary Putnam. Suppose you're like me, Putnam says, and can't tell an elm from a beech tree. My concept of an elm tree is exactly the same as my concept of a beech tree, I blush to confess. But even in Putnam's idiolect, that is to say, even the way he uses those terms, elm and beech, the set of elms is not the set of beeches, and he knows that. He's aware they're two different kinds of trees, he just can't tell the difference. They look a lot alike, their leaves are even a lot alike. And so he says, look at this, I apply these terms do apply to different things, and yet my concept is just the same. So his conclusion is meaning ain't in the head. There's something going on here that isn't in me, that isn't determined by my concepts. And Locke, of course, would agree. Locke would say, yeah, there's something happening in the world there, the real internal constitution, and we have to take that into account. This is a puzzle if we think of things the way Aristotle thought of them, or the way the medieval tradition did, because then it should be the case that the concept determines that extension. There should be a correspondence between what's really going on there in the world and what's going on in my mind, having a certain concept, having a meaning of a term. But Locke says that's not quite right. Remember, those terms of substances have a kind of dual aspect to them. They refer to what corresponds to the definition. That's socially determined. That's the workmanship of the understanding. But they also refer to the real internal constitution in the world. So let's look at this case. Elms and beeches. In a way, there's the same nominal essence, at least for a lot of people. They're just North American deciduous trees. And here are photographs. They do look kind of similar. And you might think, yeah, I don't know what's the difference between an elm and a beech. I think I actually know. When I was a kid, I lived across from Elm Leaf Park. So there were lots of elms there, and they have a very distinctive kind of seed. I can't give you the scientific characterization exactly, but on the other hand, I think I can tell the difference. Well, not sure. Haven't been there in a long time. Anyway, so for many people, the concept might be the same. It's just North American deciduous tree. And in fact, look it up in a dictionary. Maybe that's all it says. But there are different real essences in this case. The real internal constitution of an elm is different from the real internal constitution of a beech. And in particular, an elm tree has the scientific classification Ulmus americana, and a beech is Fagus grandifolia. They're different biological categories. They are different species, even in different families, as you can see. And so they just happen to look a lot alike, but their scientific nature is really quite different. So, same nominal essence, Locke would say, but very different real essence. Well, Aristotle and Aquinas would say that we know objects by grasping their essences, by way of ideas or concepts. But Locke says, hold on a second, which essence? Is it the nominal essence? That, I agree, is determined by the concept. It corresponds to the concept or the meaning of the term. It's done in terms of secondary qualities. It is conditioned by the mind, so it's mind-dependent. But the real essence, that's a very different animal. It's the real internal constitution of the thing. It's really out there in the world. It's done in terms of primary qualities. And it's unconditioned by our own mental faculties. It is mind-independent. It's really in the thing. And so when you say we know objects by grasping their essences, it really matters whether you think what you're grasping is really fully characterized by something dependent on the mind, that concept, or whether it's something in that thing independently of us. They're in the world, that real essence, the real internal constitution. So when we look at a diagram like that classic philosophical diagram I've shown you, where the thought has a certain content, and we use a term for that content, like triangle, that means or connotes a certain essence or form that applies to the thing, and the term refers to that thing, the concept applies to that thing, by virtue of that connection to an essence or a form. Locke says that's a bit misleading. Why? When you get a term like triangle, there's no problem, because we can ask which essence, the real or the nominal essence of triangle, and in the case of triangle, they're just the same. There is no underlying real internal constitution of a triangle that is going to say, oh, well, yeah, you think of it as a plane figure connected and having three angles, but actually there's a real different underlying constitution. No, in the case of a triangle, they're just the same. It's a bit like ship in that regard. But with a natural kind term like elm or beech, it's different. We say, filling in that picture, we've got a concept, we've got the term elm. It means, well, a certain kind of essence, being an elm, and that applies to that elm tree. And so my term elm refers to that tree. My concept applies to that tree. But Locke will say, which essence are we talking about? Are we talking about the nominal essence or the real essence? If we're talking about the nominal essence, I agree with you that it's connected to the meaning of that term. I agree with you that it's the content of your concept. But now I want to say that's not really the thing in the world that elm tree is exhibiting. It's not really characterizing the nature or the essence of that elm in the real sense. So the nominal essence here might be just North American deciduous tree. Well, in a way that does apply. This thing is a North American deciduous tree. But the problem Putnam is pointing out is that that's not going to distinguish the elm from the beech. There are two different real essences corresponding to it. Ulmus americana for the elm, but then Fagus grandifolia for the beech tree. And the problem is, if the nominal essence is what we're really talking about, grasping here, we're going to be in trouble because that's something that applies just as well to a beech. A beech is also a North American deciduous tree. So in short, we won't be able to draw the right distinction. If we're really to distinguish elms from beeches, and if the meanings of our terms are going to be different, if we're going to have different extensions and say, yeah, look, an elm is a kind of tree and so is a beech, but they're not the same kind. Elms are not beeches and beeches are not elms. We better not rest content with that picture. So, to put all this in Locke's language, we could say this. Putnam says meaning doesn't determine reference. Locke would say the nominal essences don't determine the real essences. The signification of the word and the real essence of the thing are not exactly the same, Locke says. That means there's going to be a difference between the content of our concept in a lot of cases and the real essence of the thing in the world. Our definitions are not going to be getting at the true natures of things. That does mean sometimes our concepts are going to be confused and inadequate. And in fact, Locke thinks they very often are. In fact, he goes so far as to say, in a certain sense, all of our complex ideas of substances are inadequate. But also, it raises the kind of possibility that Putnam points to. We could have one nominal essence with two real essences. We could have two nominal essences for the same real essence. So, the case of the elms and the beeches, that is a case of one nominal essence, namely North American deciduous tree, for two real essences. And we could also have the opposite problem, two nominal essences for the same real essence. Something like the morning star and the evening star, both referring to the same planet, Venus. There is one nominal essence there in the morning. The nominal essence of the morning star is the thing that appears in the morning. The evening star, the thing that appears in the evening. Two different nominal essences, but they point to the same object. And so there's the same real essence, which is the real internal constitution, the real scientific understanding of Venus. But then, to take a different example that Putnam talks about, we could have an imaginary case where we've got two nominal essences for the same real essence, in the sense that we have two different, actually my picture does not correspond to that at all. I apologize. I'll get to that in a second. We could have, for example, one way of thinking about the same underlying object and a very different way of thinking about it where it's a kind. The evening star and the morning star, well, that's the same object, but do the same thing with kinds. We might have this kind of thing discovered over in this part of the world, this kind of thing discovered in this part of the world. We might think of them as different things, but then through scientific investigation, we find out that they're actually the same. Two very different manifestations of the same underlying essence. It's harder to think of good examples of that, but that's the kind of thing that can happen easily enough if we've got different communities investigating different things, often with different nominal essences, partly because they have different interests, they're focusing on different secondary qualities of the thing, but partly also because in different contexts, the secondary qualities, the appearances may be quite different. Think about, for example, people thinking about water in a setting where they're encountering it mostly in liquid form, and then somebody living above the Arctic Circle, for example, where they're encountering it mostly in frozen form. They may have different nominal essences for what is ultimately the same phenomenon. And the same thing can happen in weather patterns, where we have a concept of a typhoon and a concept of a cyclone, and so on. And maybe scientifically they end up being the same thing. But we end up being in a position where we're thinking that it's sort of a scientific discovery that they're the same thing. We thought we had two different kinds of thing, and it turns out they're not. But it can go in the other direction. We can think we've got one kind of thing, and it can turn out to be two different kinds of thing. So Putnam gives us an example of that. We go to another planet, call it twin Earth. We see something there that looks exactly like water, and indeed people on that planet have exactly the same nominal essence. They characterize it in the same ways we do, as a colorless, odorless, liquid necessary to life, but actually its chemical composition ends up being something different. That would be a case of one nominal essence in a case of two real essences. So rather like the example of the elms and the beeches. In any event, when we think about natural kind terms like water, or like elm, or beech, or gold, or wax, we are forced to say there is a distinction between the way we characterize the essence of an object in everyday terms using secondary qualities and the way science classifies it in terms of primary qualities. Often we hope our science is getting it right and our intuitive concepts are right, and so we hope they match up. But they don't have to match up. It might turn out that our categories aren't quite accurate in ordinary speech and ordinary conceptualization. It might turn out we have two different concepts for what is in the end the same thing. It could be that we have things that are not distinguished in our conceptual sphere and in our language that really ought to be, and that once we investigate, we find out are different phenomena at a scientific level. So real essences are there in the world. Nominal essences are in our use of language and in our thinking about the world. That makes it look like I'm saying I'm crazy. I hope I'm not, but Locke would say, look, as soon as I get to an ordinary substance, it's very likely that these things come apart, they diverge, and my concept is not adequate to the thing. So it is very easy for our understandings to get further and further away from what's in reality. If we don't distinguish these two kinds of essence, we can't understand what we're doing in investigating what makes something what it is. It's, to some extent, a question of what makes us apply that term to it. That's the nominal essence question. But sometimes it's what is its true underlying nature that makes it have the properties it has. And that's a question of its real essence, its real internal constitution.